state security services say at least 40 people are dead and over 100 injured after heavily armed gunmen burst into a packed theatre near Moscow and opened fire. Now, it happened at the Crocus Concert Hall, part of which is in flames after explosives were detonated. Steve Rosenberg, our Russia editor, has the very latest from Moscow, and there are some upsetting scenes in his report.
A Russian concert hall under attack. Gunmen had stormed the venue near Moscow, the Crocus City Hall. They went on the rampage, shooting their way through the building and into the auditorium. There was supposed to be a rock concert here. Instead, this. The attackers walked through the stalls, firing indiscriminately. Dozens of people are reported to have been killed. They've set the hall on fire. The hall's on fire, he says, as more shots ring out. Then the rush to escape. There's panic, she says, as the crowds fled from the auditorium and tried to get out. Soon, the whole building was ablaze. The mayor of Moscow said it was a terrible tragedy. The Russian Foreign Ministry called it a bloody terrorist attack. I saw how the terrorists came in and started shooting everyone, he says. We were led to an exit, but it was locked. We ran around looking for a way out. In the end, we went into the basement and waited for the emergency services. Police and Russian special forces rushed to the scene. Some of the attackers are reported to have escaped. The search is on to find them. 2 weeks ago, the US Embassy here issued a warning that extremists plan to target large gatherings in Moscow, including concerts, within 48 hours. It's not clear whether there's any connection between that alert and this attack.
The images are just horrible and just hard to watch, and our thoughts obviously are going to be with the victims of this terrible, terrible shooting attack.
Who were the attackers? There's been no confirmation on their identities from the Russian authorities. But late tonight, Islamic State claimed responsibility for the attack. The scale of destruction and loss of life is becoming clear after an assault on civilians that has shocked Russia.
Shock, the operative word, Steve. Any word tonight on the whereabouts of the attackers? Did they get away?
Well, the latest information we have is they did get away, possibly in a white car, so the search is on to find them. Who were they? Ukraine has said it had nothing to do with this attack. And as I mentioned in that report a short while ago, there were reports that Islamic State had claimed responsibility for the attack on the concert hall. The Russian authorities have yet to comment on that. Vladimir Putin has made no public comment on what happened at the Crocus City Concert Hall, but we're told he's been kept up to date with events there. Meanwhile, security has been stepped up here in the Russian capital at key installations, so for example at airports, at railway stations. Of course, questions are already being asked, Clive. How is it possible for armed men to get into a very prominent concert venue where there were potentially thousands of people attending this concert and carry out such a bloody attack, especially since earlier this month US diplomats had warned that some kind of attack on a public gathering in Moscow, possibly a concert, was imminent. Now, the Americans were talking about an attack within 48 hours. It didn't happen, but of course what we've seen tonight in Moscow was a terrible attack. At least dozens of people killed, and an attack which has shocked this whole country.
Yeah, Steve, briefly, you mentioned Islamic State claiming responsibility. Is that a shock, a surprise, potentially, to people where you are?
Well, there were suggestions that an IS attack was possible here, so perhaps it won't come as so much of a shock. But as I say, the search continues for the attackers, and perhaps we'll have more information on this tomorrow.
Sure. Okay. The live shot there, the scene outside that concert hall, security, of course, incredibly stepped up. Thanks, Steve. Steve Rosenberg there in Moscow. Let's get a reaction from Washington with Sarah Smith, our North America editor, who is there. And from Kiev, Sarah Rainsford, our Eastern Europe correspondent, is there too. Sarah, first of all, what are the White House saying about all this?
Well, here, US officials are saying that America does have intelligence which they believe confirms that Islamic State were responsible for this attack, and they believe the statement made by ISIS. Our news partner here in America, CBS, has a source who says that there's been a steady stream of intelligence dating as far back as November, saying that ISIS wanted to strike in Moscow, and that intelligence was shared with the Russian authorities under what's known as the duty to warn. So it's being assumed that that warning that the State Department put out, that Steve Rosenberg referred to, telling Americans to stay away from large gatherings, including concerts, because the US was monitoring reports that extremists were preparing to strike imminently. It's presumed that that was related to this intelligence about Islamic State wanting to strike in Moscow.
Okay, Sarah Rainsford, over to you in Kiev. The Ukrainians were very quick to make it clear they were not part of this. They were not responsible.
Yeah, and I think, of course, because Russia and Ukraine are at war, it was inevitable that some might suggest that Kiev was some way involved. We have heard very quickly from officials in Kiev, that is not the case. The Foreign Ministry put out a statement saying it categorically rejects any kind of accusation of Ukrainian involvement. We heard from a presidential advisor, too, saying Ukraine has nothing to do with it. He said there was no way that Ukraine would attack civilians in this way, and that Ukraine's war with Russia will be decided on the battlefields. Now, Ukrainian military intelligence went much further, and they in fact accused Russia of staging this attack, saying it needs to bolster support for its war and for mobilization to find more soldiers to actually fight for Vladimir Putin's war on Ukraine. There is no evidence of that. Of course, these are two countries very much involved in an information and psychological war as well as one on the battlefield. So there's a lot that's still unclear, but I can tell you that here in Ukraine, as the news of that attack in Moscow was coming in, there was fear here because people were worried that Ukraine would be blamed and that would have consequences here in Ukraine, that there could be an escalation of Russia's war on Ukraine, more devastating attacks. Just after last night, we saw 150 missiles and drones fired by Russia right across Ukraine.
Well, the big question, who was responsible for what is now being called the worst terror attack in Russia for many years? Gordon Carrera, our security correspondent, is here. So it seems as if the finger of blame is being moved away from Ukraine. The Americans, we heard Sarah Smith suggest, are claiming it was Islamic State.
Yes, and in the last hour we've had this statement from so-called Islamic State ISIS saying they were responsible and that their attackers had somehow got back to their bases safely, was the language they use. Now, we can't independently confirm that at this point, and occasionally we've seen false claims from the group in the past, so we have to have a bit of caution. However, I think it was always a strong possibility. Why? Well, the nature of this attack, marauding gunmen going around trying to kill as many civilians as possible, that is the kind of thing we've seen ISIS doing in the past. For instance, we saw it at a concert in Paris in 2015 at the Bataclan Theatre, something very similar. So we'll have to wait for further confirmation. Very important to see what Moscow said. As we heard there from Sarah Rainsford and Sarah Smith, there's been this question and concern that perhaps the Russians might try and blame Ukraine for it. And what would that mean? And because you've got this intelligence that the US clearly had pointing to a possible attack around March 7th on a concert, now that is significant because it suggests the US might have intercepted communications or had some kind of intelligence pointing to this, but the Russians appear to have dismissed it publicly after the Americans went public. So that's going to raise big questions for Moscow about what they knew and how seriously they took it.
Which might explain why we haven't heard from Vladimir Putin as yet. So, to be clear, the Americans would have communicated this intelligence to the Russians, despite the enmity between both sides.
Well, that's right. I mean, they made it public. So they made it public and they put it on their website for US citizens that there was this warning, and the Russians dismissed it in a statement. They described it as propaganda. So I think that will raise questions. There's always that question after an attack like this. Could it have been stopped? But here, if there's signs that a warning was dismissed, that could be very awkward for Moscow and very difficult. So I think it'll be very important to see what Vladimir Putin says and how Moscow responds to this.
Sure, indeed. OK, Gordon, thank you. Gordon Carrera, our security correspondent there.